The conference hall in Washington, D.C. had a kind of polished energy about it. The Women's Global Leadership Forum was the type of event that drew in media attention, rising political voices, and a variety of thinkers across the ideological spectrum. Attendees ranged from business executives and nonprofit leaders to young activists and a few familiar faces from the political world. It was a space curated to promote discussions, sometimes difficult discussions, around the role of women in leadership and what that looked like in the modern political landscape. There was anticipation in the air, especially when the afternoon panel began. It was titled, Power and Policy, Women Shaping the Nation, and among the panelists was Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. Though she had distanced herself from royal life, Meghan had stepped into a new kind of spotlight, speaking frequently on gender equity, representation, and what she believed was the growing need for women's voices to be centered in every political conversation. Meghan had arrived in a tailored beige suit, her hair pulled into a low bun, exuding both polish and poise. She smiled easily as she took her seat, alongside other panelists including a senator, a tech entrepreneur, a nonprofit founder, and a conservative political figure known for her time in the previous administration. There was curiosity surrounding the panel, not just because of who was there, but because of what was expected to be said. Once the introductions concluded, the moderator, a respected journalist from a major news outlet, posed the first question to the group. From your perspective, she asked, what's the greatest obstacle women face in politics today? And what role do current leaders play in either helping or harming that progress? That was when Meghan leaned forward. Her tone was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable firmness in her voice. I think we need to be honest about something, she began, looking directly at the moderator but clearly speaking to everyone. We talk about empowering women, but we often ignore the people and the behavior that undermines that empowerment. When someone publicly disrespects women, when he mocks them, belittles them, reduces them to appearances or stereotypes, how can we pretend that's not damaging? There was a stillness in the room. Meghan wasn't shouting. She wasn't emotional, but the intent behind her words was clear. He's been given the world's biggest platform, and instead of lifting women up, he's used it to attack them. She continued, let's call it what it is. That kind of leadership doesn't empower women. It intimidates them. It isolates them. Frankly, I think we need to say it plainly. He has been an enemy of women. The room reacted as expected, some gasps, some nods, and a few stiffened postures. Not everyone agreed, but no one could deny that it was a bold thing to say on stage at a national forum. The moderator nodded respectfully and allowed Meghan to finish. She then turned her attention to the rest of the panel, letting the statement settle in the air for a moment. It wasn't the first time Meghan had spoken out in this way. Over the past few years, she had become increasingly vocal about what she believed were harmful trends in public discourse. In her view, much of the regression in women's rights and influence stemmed from cultural and political leadership that refused to hold itself accountable. She had been especially critical of rhetoric she believed normalized bullying, exclusion, and condescension. To Meghan, this wasn't just about politics, it was about decency. She believed that when women saw someone in power diminish others on the basis of gender, it sent a dangerous message that no matter how hard women worked or how much they achieved, they could still be reduced by a tweet or a For her, the personal was political and so was the tone of national leadership. What struck people most wasn't just what she said, but how easily she said it as if it had been waiting in her mind, ready for a stage. It was a sentiment that resonated deeply with a segment of the audience, especially those who had long felt unheard or unseen in male-dominated political circles. And yet, it also sparked quiet tension, because everyone in that room understood who she was referring to. Karoline Levitt sat quietly as Meghan spoke, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch when the words, enemy of women, echoed through the panel hall. In fact, she barely moved. But she was listening, and as someone who had worked in the Trump White House as a press staffer, Karoline had grown accustomed to hearing bold criticisms like this, especially in public forums. What struck her was not the insult itself, but the certainty with which it was delivered, as if there were no room for disagreement or nuance. The moderator paused after Meghan's remarks, letting the comment breathe, and then turned toward Karoline. Karoline, would you like to respond? The spotlight shifted. All eyes turned to the youngest person on the panel. At just 26 years old, Karoline had built a national profile, quickly first as a communications aide, and now as a congressional candidate in New Hampshire. She had become known for her ability to stay composed under pressure and to speak with clarity, even when others expected her to be defensive or flustered. She didn't rush her response. She looked thoughtful, even slightly reserved. Before speaking, I appreciate the passion Meghan brings to this conversation. Karoline began, her voice calm and steady. And I think we can all agree that women deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, especially by those in leadership. But I also think we need to ask ourselves something important. Asterisk, she glanced around the room, not with defiance, but with quiet conviction. Asterisk, if Donald Trump is truly the enemy of women, then why did so many women choose to support him not just once, but twice? Asterisk, a ripple moved through the audience. Not outrage, not applause, just a kind of collective pause. The kind of silence that follows a question you didn't expect to be asked but no can't be ignored. Asterisk, Karoline continued. Millions of women voted for him. That includes women in small towns, suburban neighborhoods, inner cities, rural communities, women of every background. They're not invisible, they're not brainwashed, and they're certainly not anti-woman. Asterisk, she wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't grandstanding. She was simply speaking. Asterisk, they supported him because they believed he heard them. They believed he fought for their ability to choose how to raise their families, how to run their businesses, how to worship, how to speak. And whether or not you agree with everything he said or how he said it, they felt that, for once, someone was standing up for them instead of talking over them. There were nods in the room now, some subtle, some clear. She didn't defend every past comment he'd made. She didn't even mention any of them. What she did was far more strategic. She shifted the focus away from personality and toward the women themselves, the voters who had made their choices with full agency. Asterisk, it's easy to judge from a distance, she said. It's harder to listen closely to the people who don't have the microphone. And I think that's what's missing from this conversation. Asterisk, there was a quiet tension again. But this time, it was the kind that didn't come from came from reflection. People were thinking, reassessing. Even Meghan appeared thoughtful, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in contemplation. Asterisk, Karoline had used her time not to attack, but to ask a question that reframed the entire narrative. She didn't deny the experiences of women who felt hurt or dismissed by Trump's language, but she also didn't dismiss the voices of women who had felt empowered by his policies, his unapologetic defense of their rights to speak freely, own guns, protect their children's education, and question institutional narratives without being labeled. Asterisk, it was a shift in tone and substance. By placing the focus on the everyday American woman, rather than the high-profile headlines, Karoline introduced complexity into a conversation that had just been flattened by a single label. Asterisk, the audience didn't erupt. There was no dramatic applause, but there was something more powerful, a shared moment of reconsideration. Karoline had made her point, not with defiance, but with dignity. She had listened carefully, and then responded not with slogans, but with a question that couldn't be ignored. Asterisk, the panel had taken a noticeable turn after Karoline Leavitt's comment. Meghan Markle's strong declaration had clearly made an impact, but it was Karoline's calm and measured response that had shifted the tone in the room. For a moment, the usual battle lines drawn in political debate were suspended. The audience seemed unsure whether they had just witnessed a challenge or an invitation to think differently. Asterisk, it wasn't what Karoline said at length, it was what she said in just one sentence. That sentence hung in the air longer than most people expected. Asterisk, if Donald Trump is the enemy of women, why did millions of women vote for him not once, but twice? Asterisk, it was simple, but it was also powerful. It didn't accuse, it didn't belittle, it didn't play defense or offense. Instead, it asked a question that demanded honesty, not from Meghan, not from Karoline, but from the country itself. Asterisk. That one line took the entire conversation out of the realm of personality politics and into something deeper. It wasn't just about Trump anymore, it was about the women who had made a deliberate choice. Not once, in a moment of confusion, but twice. After 4 years of seeing exactly who he was, how he spoke, and how he governed, it was about real women. Many of them mothers, workers, churchgoers, students who had stepped into a voting booth with full knowledge and still cast their ballots for him. Asterisk, the moderator, caught slightly off guard by how direct the question was, let the moment stretch. She didn't immediately move on. It was as if she, too, realized something different had just occurred. The panel hadn't descended into shouting or crossfire. No one had interrupted. But the entire atmosphere had shifted. Asterisk, some people in the audience instinctively resisted the premise. Others leaned forward, not because they agreed, but because they couldn't deny that it was a fair question. That was the genius of Karoline's approach. It didn't ask for emotional reaction. It asked for intellectual honesty. Asterisk, Trump was, and remains, a deeply polarizing figure. His language, particularly on social media, had often drawn harsh criticism from both sides of the aisle. His past comments about women had been replayed, dissected, and criticized endlessly. He had been labeled sexist, crude, unpresidential. Those labels stuck in certain circles. But Karoline's sentence quietly disrupted that narrative by pointing out a massive inconsistency. If he was truly the enemy of women, Why did so many women freely and consciously choose to support him? Asterisk, the implication was not that every woman who voted for him approved of everything he said. It was that they saw something else in him, something more important to their daily lives than tone or tweets. Maybe it was his stance on protecting small businesses during the pandemic, maybe it was his tough talk on border security, or his opposition to bureaucratic overreach in schools and healthcare. Maybe it was simply that he didn't talk like a politician, and they were tired of being talked down to by people who did. Asterisk, Karoline's sentence allowed for all of that. It didn't pretend Donald Trump was perfect. It didn't ignore his flaws, but it forced the room and the country to face the reality that his support wasn't limited to men in red hats. Millions of women had cast their votes for him after hearing and seeing everything the media warned about, and they did it anyway. Asterisk, that reality didn't fit neatly into Meghan's version of the narrative. It didn't mean Meghan was wrong to express concern over how women were treated in the public sphere. But it did suggest that those concerns, while valid, were not universally defining for all women. Asterisk, Karoline's sentence didn't silence Meghan. It didn't insult her either. It simply asked a question that couldn't be ignored. And for a moment, even those who had come into the room ready to dismiss her as just another conservative had to admit she'd said something that made them think. Asterisk, the silence after that sentence wasn't awkward. It was respectful. It was the kind of pause that happens when someone introduces a truth that doesn't have an immediate rebuttal. A moment when ideology gives way, even briefly, to introspection. Asterisk. After the panel concluded, attendees milled around the conference hall, replaying the conversation in their minds. Some whispered about Meghan Markle's bold declaration, while others kept revisiting the unexpected calm and clarity in Karoline Leavitt's response. What made Karoline's contribution especially impactful wasn't just her composure or her pointed question. It was the way she managed to humanize the political debate without backing down from her convictions. It felt different. It wasn't defensive or performative. It was grounded in the reality of millions of Americans, specifically millions of women, who often felt talked over in national conversations. Asterisk, when she stepped off the stage, several young women approached her not with political chants or party slogans, but with quiet admiration. They weren't there to cheer for Trump or to debate Meghan's views. They came because something about Karoline's tone had struck a nerve. She hadn't tried to prove Trump was perfect or pretend he'd never said anything controversial. Instead, she'd focused on the people who supported him, people who were rarely discussed without being stereotyped or dismissed. Asterisk, Karoline had managed to do something unusual. She spoke to both the political and the personal. By acknowledging the complexity of women voters, she gave voice to a group that is often oversimplified. In media portrayals, support for Trump among women is often reduced to confusion, misinformation, or blind loyalty. But Karoline pushed back on that without raising her voice. She reminded the room subtly but unmistakably that not all women shared the same experience or definition of empowerment. Asterisk, that was a powerful message, especially considering where she came from. As someone who had worked directly in the Trump administration, Karoline knew exactly how the media viewed her. She wasn't surprised by the assumptions, and she didn't waste time trying to undo them. Instead, she leaned into the truth she knew best, that millions of everyday women had looked at Trump's record in taxes, the economy, immigration, school choice, even foreign policy, and made a choice based on their values, not his vocabulary. Asterisk, her sentence about why so many women voted for him twice wasn't just a political observation. It was a cultural one. It reminded people that women are not a monolith. They don't all view the world through the same lens, and they certainly don't all view Donald Trump the same way. For every woman who found his rhetoric off-putting, there was another who appreciated his bluntness. For every woman who wished he'd tweet less, there was another who admired that he said what others wouldn't. Asterisk, Karoline wasn't asking anyone to ignore the things Trump had said in the past, but she was challenging the idea that those things automatically erased everything else. That was what made her argument so difficult to dismiss. It wasn't rooted in denial. It was rooted in perspective. Asterisk, that kind of reasoning didn't go viral. It didn't make for an explosive soundbite, but it did resonate with people who were tired of being told how they should feel. It gave quiet validation to women who had supported Trump, not because they condoned everything he said, but because they felt his policies aligned more closely with their hopes for the future for their families, their businesses, their security. Asterisk, Karoline's presence on that stage made something clear. There was a generational shift happening. Younger conservative women were no longer willing to let others define feminism or empowerment for them. They weren't shouting or demanding attention, but they were stepping up measured, poised, and ready to speak plainly. They didn't need to shout over their opponents to be heard. They just needed a microphone and a moment. Asterisk, for some in the room, Karoline's comments were a reality check. For others, they were a relief. And for a few, they were a challenge, a reminder that the story of American women isn't as simple as one side versus the other. It's far more layered than that. Asterisk, and by simply asking a question, and doing so without theatrics. Karoline had revealed just how out of touch some public narratives had become. It wasn't about defending a man, it was about defending the right of women to think for themselves, even if their choices didn't fit into someone else's expectations. Asterisk. As the crowd dispersed and the buzz from the panel began to fade, the echoes of the exchange lingered. Meghan Markle's charge that Donald Trump was an enemy of women had certainly landed with force. But it was Karoline Leavitt's quiet, composed response that stayed with people. She hadn't needed a counterattack, a dramatic gesture, or even a long speech. She'd simply introduced a question that cut through the noise. If he was truly the enemy of women, why did millions of women vote for him? Asterisk. That question didn't just reframe the moment. It reframed the entire conversation around women, politics, and personal agency. Asterisk. Karoline reminded everyone that political disagreement does not equate to betrayal of one's gender, and that the act of thinking independently is a form of empowerment in itself. She didn't ask anyone to agree with everything Trump had done or said. What she asked was far more challenging: to see the women who supported him as thoughtful, rational, and deserving of respect. Asterisk. In an age where so much of political commentary is reduced to soundbites and tribal loyalty, Karoline's approach stood out. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't combative, but it was deeply effective. She addressed the substance of Meghan's claim without ever resorting to personal attacks. And in doing so, she offered something rare: a space for complexity, in a conversation often dominated by absolutes. Asterisk. This moment didn't just showcase Karoline's poise, it illuminated a broader cultural shift. More and more women, particularly young, conservative women, are refusing to accept the narrative that their worth or wisdom is tied to a specific political ideology. They are willing to challenge assumptions, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to do so without apology. Asterisk. Karoline's sentence didn't just disrupt the conversation, it reshaped it, and that's what made it so powerful. Asterisk. Because in the end, the real story wasn't about Meghan or Trump. It was about the millions of women in America who make decisions every day based on what they believe is right for their families, their futures, and their freedom. It was about honoring their ability to think critically even when their choices challenged the popular narrative. Asterisk. By standing firm, asking the hard question, and doing so with dignity, Karoline Leavitt didn't just respond, she elevated the conversation. And in doing so, she reminded the country that true empowerment doesn't come from conformity. It comes from the courage to speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient.